Okay, so in chapter 4, we're going to talk more about Hada's childhood. We're also hear news about or information about his experience as a medical officer in the Japanese Imperial Army. This is during World War II. We're introduced to the character of Captain Ono, and he is a role model, someone who Franklin Hadda looked up to during his military service. And we also hear news information about what Sunny is up to. So, as you'll remember, what we've learned in the first 3 chapters is that uh, Doc Hadda is estranged from his adopted daughter, and in chapter 4, we finally hear what has happened to her since their estrangement, which was, you know, uh, when she was sort of 18 or 19, very sort of young. They stopped talking, and we learn what she's been up to since that time. Okay, so let's continue our discussion of A Gesture Life by Chang Rae Lee, Chapter 4. So in the present of the novel, Hadda is still recovering in the hospital from smoke inhalation. He befriends a young lady who is working as a candy striper, so a young girl. And it turns out he knows this young girl's mother, who is a police officer in Bedley Run. And he knows of this officer because his daughter, Sunny, had some run-ins with this police officer when she was a rebellious teenager. So he had to deal with this cop, this officer, when he was parent to Sunny, and she had some troubles with the law. Um, in this chapter, we also gain some information about Hadda's previous life. He sort of has flashbacks or memories, or at this point in his life, he's sort of looking at the big picture of what he's gone through and everything that's happened to him. And he thinks back on his own his own childhood, which was difficult. And he says he was a difficult child, and he sort of provides information about his early life. So he was born to a family who had sort of some economic uh, difficulties. They were a family of ethnic Koreans. This is on page 72. So he says it was, for me, it was the readily leaving the narrow existence of my family and our ghetto of hide tanners and renderers. Most all of us were ethnic Koreans, though we spoke and lived as Japanese if one's in twilight. So his family circumstances, he comes from a Korean family that lives in Japan. They were tanners and renderers by occupation, so they didn't have a lot of sort of economic means to support their family. And Hadda sort of separates himself from his family because he scores exceptionally high on academic tests, and he's placed in a special school, and he's sort of arranged to be adopted by a Japanese childless couple, a gear factory owner and his wife, who treat him as if they were his son. He adopts their last name, so the last name Kurohata is his adopted Japanese name, and he's since shortened it just to Hadda, where we get the name Doc Hadda. So his natural parents, he doesn't really have a strong relationship with. His adopted parents sort of look after him from the time that he's 12 to the time that he enters the military, and he doesn't really express a lot of sort of love for either side of his family. But he does say, I think of them most warmly as I do my natural parents, but to neither would I ascribe the business of having reared me, for it seems clear that it was the purposeful society that did so, and really nothing and no one else. So he sees himself as sort of raised by just society as a whole. He's grateful for, his parents and adopted parents for looking after him, but he doesn't really see himself as being raised in any sort of direct way by his parents. It's more of he's a social society that kind of made him who he was. And he also sort of, and in this scene, it sort of identifies him as he's Korean born, but he identifies as a Japanese man. So this will become kind of more important as we learn of his interactions with the Korean comfort women, who are will be sort of integral to his secret past and the sort of history, the events that traumatic history that torments him. So his ethnic heritage does play a role in who he identifies with and how he sort of views his own sense of identity. So that is all we learn about Hada's childhood. The rest remains sort of a mystery. He's not very forthcoming as a narrator to tell us, anything more specific than that short little bit of information about his childhood. So in chapter 4, this is our first glimpse that Hada has military service in his past. So the first time that we hear about this is on page 68. So this is the first time he mentions his service as a medic for the Japanese Imperial Army. So this was a time when the Japanese Imperial Army was sort of expanding and occupied surrounding Asian countries, and they were sort of had the attempt to sort of consolidate Asian countries under an umbrella of sort of imperial expansion. So the Japanese Army sort of, the historical context sort of saw Japan conquer and colonize other Asian countries, including Korea. And Hada's, heritage as a Korean-born man who's serving for the Japanese Army sort of situates him as sort of both inside and outside. So he's kind of an insider in the fact that he is serving the Japanese Army, but he's also kind of an outsider because his heritage is Korean. So he's sort of both inside and outside in terms of that sort of racial hierarchy that existed at this time. So Japan wanted to sort of colonize and conquer the other Asian countries, and maybe had, goals of further sort of military expansion. And at this time, their conquest of other nations was quite aggressive, but there was always this looming threat. This was that sort of during World War II, where the presence of the Americans was in sort of the looming shadows of the end of World War II. So that was also in the background of his service for the Imperial Army. So according to one author, Richard H. Mitchell, he sort of talks about the racial hierarchy that existed between sort of the Japanese political imperial entity and other sort of surrounding Asian countries. So Koreans were viewed as an inferior people in comparison. That's how they were perceived by the Japanese. And Mitchell states, the Japanese consider the Koreans as inferior people and often discriminated against them. They would conscript Korean men into the Imperial Army, so they were forced to serve for Japan. And they used Korean migrants as part of their labor force. And out of all sort of Asian countries, Korea was, one of the most suffered a lot of sort of destruction at the hands of Japanese sort of conquest. So we'll see evidence of that in the way that the comfort women will be treated by the Japanese army during this time. 70%, this is according to George Hicks, 70% of all the comfort women who were forced to serve as sort of sex slaves for the Japanese military came from Korea. So they were taken against their will, and we'll learn more about that as the story goes on. But for just now, it's important to note that Hada is Korean born, but he sort of identifies himself as a Japanese man. So he's adopted into a Japanese family, and he's serving Japan as a medic, but he is a Korean born. So it's an interesting place or subject position that he's sort of placed into at this time. So Hada has kind of almost like a flashback when he goes to actually look at the Hinkies' poor, sort of sick son who's also in the hospital, who's waiting for sort of a transplant. And he flashes back to the first time, or he remembers his superior officer, Captain Ono, performing surgery on a laborer, and it's kind of this image of Captain Ono, who will have a larger role as the story goes on, who acts almost like godlike and in his role as a medical officer. So Captain Ono takes his patient, who is a Burmese man, a cobbler, who was found stealing from the supply tent. So this is on page 76 and 77. Captain Ono takes this Burmese man and treats him almost like, that his life doesn't really even matter at all. This man has been sentenced to death for stealing, which is, seems like harsh punishment for a petty crime. The fact that he's a Burmese man also sort of suggests that racial hierarchy is playing a role in this man's death. Captain Ono is, a Japanese medical man of higher standing. So in the military hierarchy, captain is, at the top or near the top. And Captain Ono takes this man and gathers all the medical students, including Doc Hada, and performs surgery on him, cutting this man's chest open, spreading his ribs, and then manipulating this man's heart. So literally taking this man's life in his hands, and then ends up sort of killing this man, or watching his heart stop beating. So using this person, this human, as a kind of medical object. So objectifying him, dehumanizing him, and just treating him as just a thing. So it's a very sort of glimpse into Captain Ono's character, how cold and ruthless, and how he sees himself as superior and treats others. So the doctor is sort of cold and unfeeling,